Good morning. Today is June 24th, and our subject of the day is going to be talking about how we represent a seller. We'll be talking about what it means to help a seller who is not listed on the MLS. So kind of like a for sale by owner, but instead of representing buyer, we're going to talk about how we would just represent a seller. In the discussion today, we're going to talk about the difference between a listing agreement and a seller representation. So the two forms I'm discussing are going to be 1A and Form 47. How to note our agency relationship and how to ensure that when we write up a purchase and sale agreement that we not only get compensated correctly, but we're also showing our true representation. So number one, when we have a seller that we represent, how do we get paid? We don't typically have something already in place. So when we're talking to a seller, we don't have a listing agreement. And we're all aware of how we get paid when a seller publishes in the Northwest MLS, because there's an offer of compensation to any cooperating broker. But what happens if there's nothing being offered, right? So step one we're going to talk about is what to do to put that together. Step one is knowing who you represent and what that means. This is including negotiations, how you talk to anybody who's involved in your transaction. And step two is going to be how to draft it up in a way that we show our representation and make sure that everything follows through with that getting paid at the end. So with sellers, how do we represent a seller? Our agency law states that all agents represent the buyer unless we have an agency relationship representing the seller. So when we get this agreement, we need to create that agency relationship. And the way we get that agency relationship in a written agreement is by the seller representation form, Form 47. Now, I don't actually have the form in its entirety because what I wanted to mainly talk about today was the differences between what it means to have a seller representation versus a listing agreement. So number one, they look very similar. However, they have completely different implications. So Form 47 is a seller representation where you have an identified buyer. If you have a seller who does not yet have an identified buyer, then what we need to be thinking about is doing a listing agreement rather than seller representation, because seller representation is only so we can put this contract together with the identified buyer. When you fill it out, it's filled out a lot like the listing agreement. We are going to identify who the seller is. We ourselves writing up this form are the agent who was hired to do this, and our real estate firm, John L. Scott Madrona Group, is going to go into the line 3, which is the relationship between the seller and the firm, just like our listing agreements. Now, the property known as is going to be the address, just as our listing agreement. So everything between the two of those forms on top is pretty much the same. So they differ once you start looking down the form. I've color coded this to try to keep a little bit of continuity between which one I'm talking about. So the green dots are going to be the seller representation, and these gold dots are going to be the listing agreement. When you have a seller representation, like I said, you do need to have an identified buyer. So line 1 identifies who that buyer is. Now, if this is with a buyer, more than one buyer, maybe that seller potentially has either this neighbor or this neighbor who wants to purchase. You can actually write up 2 seller representation forms. But the idea for this one is that there's already been a second party identified. When you have a listing agreement, that definition says that you're going to be putting it onto the Northwest MLS. You're going to be trying to sell it, and that the firm basically needs to have this communication and constant with the principal hired, right, with the seller, who will have communication that you're going to try to provide and bring in a bona fide offer for that. Now, the terms can be negotiated just like a listing agreement for that seller representation. The default for seller representation is only 30 days. And the idea behind that is that you have already identified that buyer, and that seller does not plan on going live on the Northwest MLS or any public forum for that matter. With the listing agreement, that seller is giving you permission to go ahead and have this contract between you until the end of that listing term. And there is actually no default days for this. So this would be the same conversations you have with your listing sellers as far as how long you're going to have it under contract as representing the listing. We are going to think about this in a way that the green dots represent more the person selling, and the gold dots represent the address being listed. Now, both of these forms require agency disclosure. We need to make sure that we are giving the pamphlets. We need to make sure that we are also showing our representation to that client. And if you notice on Form 47, which again is the green dot, the seller representation verbiage calls that broker the seller's broker, not the listing broker. And that's because we are not going to have a listing when we only represent a seller who does not want to be published. With the listing agreement, we are putting it live. We are providing a listing. So think about it in that way, where if there is no listing going live and you only want to represent seller, you're going to use an agreement that says you are the seller's representative, not the listing broker. We always have to remember everybody gets our agency pamphlets, and this is a potential seller, a potential buyer, whether that seller is represented by you off market or on the market. This is a required document that everybody gets. Now, both of these agreements with these potential sellers are going to require the consent for dual agency if that should come up. It may come up with seller representation if you've been working with a buyer and maybe by chance that buyer found this off-market sale, that seller chooses not to be represented by anybody other than you, but the same rules apply. You have to have a seller representation agreement as well as a buyer representation agreement, and both of them have to consent to you being the dual agent in order to check this box right here and initial it. The listing agreement down below with the gold is the same way. If you have a listing agreement in writing with you and that client, and you have a buyer representation, then you would potentially be that dual agent. However, everybody needs to still consent, whether they are published or not. Now, the compensation is where things get a little bit different. So the green dot above, again, is the seller representation. And the seller and you, when you're sitting down writing this agreement, are going to decide what your compensation is as the agent representing them. There is no offer of compensation to a cooperating broker with this agreement. This is only because in this situation, you are that seller's agent. When you make a sale off market and represent a seller, we do also want to make sure that we are inputting the data into the Northwest MLS when that sale closes. So we need to make sure we're at least taking one picture or we have some sort of sketch, and we're going to report all of the information to the Northwest MLS. We're going to be reporting things to potentially any financial institution that might be a party to this, any appraisers. This is to give permission to basically pull this through as if it were a normal transaction that was listed, so that everybody involved can have the information they need. Also, reporting this data to the Northwest MLS helps us when we are pricing out other homes, because it will show that it was an unlisted sale. So we can look at how much it sold for, we can look at potentially seller concessions, and we can better create what our market value is. Now in this too, the seller representation, paragraph 7, there is not going to be any marketing. So nothing will be published on the Northwest MLS, nothing will be published publicly. We are not going to be exposing this property to any other person other than the identified buyer. So by that seller recognizing and signing this form, they are saying that they understand that this property is going to be purchased by a buyer without giving the exposure of the property to the general market and the general public, and that they may in fact see a lesser price or maybe less favorable terms. And this paragraph really got me thinking about the fact that we are kind of shifting now because everybody needs a buyer agreement, that we're starting to see more buyers come that are unrepresented. And when you discuss paragraph 7, although it's very short and it's pretty clear what it says, this might be a great time for us to also mention that if a buyer comes unrepresented, what that process looks like for the seller. Now, just kind of on the flip side of this, I also wanted to pull up the listing agreement. So in the 1A, when we have a listing, our list date is going to be at a timeline where we have all the preparation to get it ready for going live on the market. We're going to be publishing it in the most public way possible and getting the most amount of exposure. And in that time, that's our preparation time. It's also a time that we get to create our marketing plan and make flyers, and all of this stuff is going to happen. Now, a seller who is identifying a buyer has probably already talked to neighbors and friends about putting their home for sale. So when they've done this, we can't exactly stop what's already happened. However, if a seller decides they want to go live and they want the exposure of the Northwest MLS, they are completely prohibited from doing any pre-marketing. This is actually one of the biggest violations that I've noticed within the last 30 days. When I looked back at the Northwest MLS, they list all the violations that different firms have had, and pre-marketing is actually one of the biggest violations that comes up. So make your sellers or potential listing sellers aware that should they choose to take advantage of putting something on the Northwest MLS and getting the most exposure possible, they need to make sure that the timing is right and they don't do anything before the date it goes live. Now, like I said, off-market sales should be reported to the Northwest MLS so we can keep the data accurate and give our clients, basically take the accurate data and basically give the agent kind of credit for making the sale, regardless of the listing status. There is not to be any kind of marketing when you are doing a seller representation. Again, I did the green dot to hopefully just kind of differentiate that this is seller representation. No marketing on seller representation. The only exposure gained is going to be through that seller who has identified the buyer. If you have a listing agreement and you are preparing it to go on the market and preparing it to go live, and then the seller brings you a buyer, you can use the seller representation instead. You can cancel that out and use seller representation. Or if you wanted to get the chance to go live, you could put it live and give that buyer, get that buyer, let the buyer know, I guess, when you have gone live that they can go ahead and put the offer through. But unless you are using a seller representation, there is no advertising of this at all. Also be really, really careful if you have a buyer agreement and you have a potential seller coming through, you're going to also have that conversation with that seller if that buyer should be interested, because you're going to want to make sure that they would be potentially okay with dual agency, and being careful not to do what they call like pocket listings, or kind of like marketing behind your back, right? We want to make sure that if the seller truly does want to put the home on the market, that we give it the right exposure. So we are working in the best interest of the client we represent. Now, Form 47 is, like I said, for totally off-market sales. They do not get published and then marked pending. There is no marketing allowed. This is not a listing agreement. This is an agreement to represent a seller in the contract. And by writing this up, you are given permission to write up that contract. If we don't have some sort of representation for either a buyer or a seller, then we actually have no permission to be writing up contracts for people. So some things to think about. I wanted to pull up some questions that we can kind of use in our real life situations here. Can Form 21 be filled out as the representation without additional documents? Meaning, can the boxes be checked without supporting forms like a 41, which is a buyer agreement, or a 47, a seller agreement? And of course, the answer is no. You have to have some sort of agency relationship in place and be able to disclose that on the purchase and sale agreement. So disclosing it just on the purchase and sale agreement is not the same as actually having that written agreement between you and the party you represent. It's the disclosure of the opposite party, not the initial relationship agreement to have that relationship. Now, looking at the purchase and sale agreement, how do we write up an unlisted sale? Well, the compensation paid from the seller to the seller agent has nothing to do with being noted on the front. There's no need to write down any compensation that you, the seller's agent, would be receiving. Any cooperating broker may have a separate agreement with their buyer in a buyer agreement to be paid. So that also doesn't need to be noted on here if the buyer is going to pay it. The only time it would need to be noted is if for some reason it was going to be negotiated with the additional form of 41C. So when writing up an unlisted sale, there's not going to be any MLS number. You can either write unlisted, you can write NA. It doesn't really matter what you write in that line because there's nothing to reference. You can we still need to have all of the required information: buyer full name, seller full name. Hopefully at this point you have pulled titles, so you have a legal description and you have the seller's full legal name that should be on the purchase and sale agreement. We want to make sure that all of the seller's full name is going to be translated in line 3. That is something that the Department of Licensing actually does check. They want to make sure that that seller's name is what their name is legally supposed to be. If there is an LLC or a representative, we want to go ahead and make note of that as well. And then, of course, our signing lines do also need to match. Now, we still are required, even in off-market sales, to list out the tax number, the tax parcel, and the address, and we're still required to have the legal description. And everything else that goes through a normal real estate transaction that's a state requirement, such as a Form 17, is also still required whether the sale is on the market or off. Now, skipping all the way down because we're talking about agency relationship and compensation, on line 16, you're going to write that you represent the seller is represented by you. Now, on this, there's no real seller representative option, but the option would be that the seller is represented by the listing broker. And that line coincides with the 2 paragraphs down below, which give all of our contact information and all of our licensing information. Now, line 17, because there is no listing agreement, there's no compensation being offered to a cooperating broker, that number is going to be 0. There is nothing offered. And like I said, if somebody wants to come in, if another agent is helping this off-market buyer, they can either have their own agreement to be paid on the, on their behind closed doors, but that has nothing to do with the seller. Or if they're negotiating, they can check other, see addendum, and go ahead and put in the proper addendum to negotiate that compensation. So is it necessary to have a buyer agency agreement if you're writing up a for sale by owner and the agent and seller have a signed Form 47? So in putting this a little bit more clear, because I kept reading this question thinking, am I asking the question that I'm trying to ask, or is it coming through the way I'm trying to ask it? If you are the agent with a signed seller representation and a buyer comes to you, is it necessary for you to write up a buyer agreement as well in order to write up the sale? And no, it's not. The buyer in this circumstance, having no agent, would be an unrepresented buyer. Now, again, as the agent, think about what this would mean. And if you were to be a dual agent, you would have to have the discussion about what that means with both clients. But in this situation also,
used to put.
was that a question? I'm sorry, I thought that was a question, sorry. In this situation, if you were to have a signed buyer agreement, you would technically be a dual agent. So if you ended up bringing the buyer and the seller together, you may want to consider actually just putting it on the market, because this is kind of walking that gray area of being accused of having a pocket listing. When we look at representation down below, we are only going to be filling in the places that we represent. So not only are we going to be marking it on line 16 and line 17, but we're also only going to fill in the half that we represent. And again, with seller representation, the seller side goes to the right. As I mentioned before, at the end of the sale, we want to go ahead and input it into the Northwest MLS so we have all the data. Now, I pulled up what the 1-ULS looks like. This is for unlisted sales, and it's actually a really simplified version of a listing input sheet. So this just has some very basic data that we need to input. Not everything on this is required, but if you can get more information, the more the better. It is a 5-page document, just like our listing agreement. There won't be marketing remarks because we are not marketing this property. There are far fewer required fields than a typical Form 1, which is the listing input sheet. But please, if you can, make sure that we get all the required data that we need so we can keep these statistics as accurate as possible in our Northwest MLS. So here's another thing to think about. A seller wants to sell his property off market, but wants to list it and then make it pending immediately. Can they do this? And the answer is yes, they can do this. But any sort of marketing that's going to happen has to be done with a listing agreement form, and then obviously the listing input with the Northwest MLS. Because a Form 47, when we represent the seller, does not give us permission to market the property. If they want to market the property in any way publicly, they have to fill out the standard listing agreement, because it does have a paragraph there that allows us to go ahead and do that marketing. And it specifies what marketing options we can give to them. And then thinking about the tail provision, because this does come up. We have a sale or we have a listing, and the listing sits and maybe it expires. And most of our listings have a tail provision. I think I've only seen one without a tail provision. But in that tail provision period, what happens if maybe you had represented that seller, the seller went off market, and then a buyer comes to you and says, you know what, I really want to buy this, or maybe it's a neighbor. And it has come from the exposure of being on the Northwest MLS, and it has come from that listing agreement that you once had. What do you do in that situation? Do you need to write up a new contract? Do you need to reinstate your listing agreement? How do we put those together to show that at one point there was an offer of compensation, it's just no longer live on the market? So if you have that situation come up, the tail provision is going to be the carryover from that previous listing paperwork. Tail provisions will not require any additional listing paperwork to be updated or revived. So if that timeline within the tail provision is still there and it's noted in the expired listing, then there is no reason to write up a new listing agreement. There's no reason to write up seller agreement. That tail provision says, I'm going to give you another, say, default 180 days. And if a buyer comes to me because of those marketing efforts, I've already offered compensation in this way. And because our Northwest MLS is so transparent about how and how much we offer in compensation, we should be able to take the expired listing, the Northwest MLS, in the detail and find out exactly what that would mean for a buyer, so we can write it up just as if it were already still live. This was kind of a short thing, but I hope that that was enough to kind of give you a good insight on whether you should be using a seller representation or whether you should be using a listing agreement. If you find yourself working with a potential seller who already may have a buyer, please consider the Form 47 over the 1A if they want to just sell it to that person prior to putting it live. And remember, anybody who does use the listing agreement form 1A is going to have the opportunity to have their home marketed, have marketing material, have open houses, and have the biggest exposure possible. So I hope this was very helpful to you and somewhat relevant, and thank you for listening.